Yeah, I don't think China's going to survive long enough to have to wrestle with that problem, but for Japan, certainly. At the moment, the labor disconnect is the single largest issue behind our inflation numbers right now. Well, Gen X and millennials have been in the labor market already, so we're already factored into the math. Now, there's pros and there's cons, and that shapes a lot of things, but we are already in. The Zoomers are the ones who are coming in to replace the Boomers. And we have our largest generation going out, our smallest generation coming in. So right now, annually, that's 400,000 worker shortage. And that will increase every year until 2034, when it'll peak at 900,000 shortage. Okay. These people are already born. They're already on the way. We know exactly what's going to happen to the net flows each and every year moving forward. Well, the baby boomers are at the height of their earning experience. And as of the end of next year, this year, they won't be earning anymore. So the net inflows into the system from just normal demographic structure dry up considerably. The next generation down, Gen X, is very small. And even if we do succeed in having significant raises now in this labor inflationary environment, there aren't enough of us to generate nearly as much in total. So step one, we're losing volume. Step two, we're losing investment quality, because in the flight from risk on to risk off, the capital becomes a lot less interesting. Sure, this is going to be broadly decent for people who want to be in the government and borrow, because that's the T-bill. That's considered the ultimate gold standard. And to a degree, that helps with the mortgage market as well, because mortgage rates primarily draw their guidance from the 10-year as opposed to interest rate levels. After that, though, you're entirely dependent on capital flight from the rest of the world. Now, I think that'll be robust, but I also think that'll be wildly inconsistent depending on what's going on in the United States versus wherever else the capital might be. This is still the deepest, most liquid market in the world. It's denominated in the sole source of global store of value. It is the only meaningful method of exchange for international transport and trade. And the Japanese and the Europeans have basically signed on to a US dollar denominated system as part of the deal that generated the sanctions against the Russian central bank a couple of months ago. So if you're going to benefit from this in any way, the US dollar is the place to be, but you can't predict the inflows year on year of what's coming in from the European space or the Asian space. It will come when they're in trouble and we look good, and it will probably never go back. And so we know that the capital supply has to drop domestically, and we know we're going to get these bursts of capital from abroad. But planning on that, that takes a smarter brain than I have. The problem is that capital is going away at the same time. I certainly agree that the relationships are going to change. I think it's a little bit arrogant to think that I know exactly how. But we're definitely entering a period of protracted and extended and increasing labor shortage. At the same time, we're entering into a period of protracted and extended and increasing capital shortage. And just to make it a little bit more fun, China's collapsing against this backdrop. So even if we decided we were fine with a completely globalized supply chain, we still need to double the size of the industrial plant in the next few years with less capital and with less labor. And the millennials themselves will then be entering their late stage worker years. Well, they will gradually become the dominant capital providing class again. So for the United States, we have a pretty big needle to pass through here, and a roughly 10 to 20 years, it can be a little loosey-goosey based on what happens with the monetary system and the Fed in that time. But in that decade of time, the United States will go back to having what we would consider a more stable capital structure. And at the same time, when you get into the 2040s, the labor market will start reconstituting based on normal demographic factors, because the millennials' kids will then be entering the workforce. We'll be through this long winter of the Zoomers. But no one else gets to do that. Everyone else went through industrialization and urbanization either faster or more intensely than the United States did. A couple exceptions, but only a couple. And so for them, they're looking at labor markets getting smaller every year and the capital supply getting smaller every year. And still in this decade, their advanced worker cadre, that big, giant last generation, moves into retirement. So their need for government spending to keep those people alive skyrockets and never drops.
And that is very problematic for places like China, Japan, Russia, etc.
The Chinese will throw a bottomless supply of capital against anything in order to make sure that people have jobs. It doesn't matter if there's a product on the back end, really, as long as the people are working. So everything that people say about the US Fed is actually true to an order of magnitude higher in China. So the US dollar is the global currency. It's the medium of exchange. It's the store of value. It's the lubricant for the number one economy and 2/3 of the top 20. The yuan is used just in China. It's not internationally traded, and they regularly expand their money supply by 5 times as much as we do. And at most times in the last 10 years, the yuan supply has been twice that of the US dollar, even though it's just not exchanged at all. So their financial system is its own thing. And to think that this is going to continue in perpetuity is being really creative with your math. They get their energy from a continental way. They don't have a navy that's capable of making that far in force in order to secure their own supply lines. So China is the country most dependent upon the US Navy to keep the lights on. In manufacturing, their demographics have aged so much already that China is no longer the low-cost producer for any manufactured product. There is not a product that the Chinese make that cannot be made in North America at a lower price point. Now, you have to build the industrial plant first. So I don't mean to suggest we can flip a switch and it's all here tomorrow. But it does mean that anytime there's a hiccup in the Chinese system for any reason and somebody relocates, they never go back because it's better with a shorter supply chain, with less energy, with less transport, with more efficient labor closer to home. There's not a sector where that doesn't work. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Some places can do that, some places can't. But it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that has as riven geographically as Africa. So the basic transport issues are very, very difficult. It would be cheaper to do more automation in a closer economy. So in the case of Germany, that's probably going to be Poland. In the case of the United States, that's probably going to be Mexico and Colombia. In the case of China, that would probably be Southeast Asia. Now, I'm not overly concerned about automation being a giant job destroyer. Remember, the Zoomers are the ones who are coming in, the smallest generation we've ever had, and they're not millennials, they're not social, they're antisocial, and they're very loyal workers. They're very nervous people because they were raised by Gen X to be told that the future was a dark place where you will have no power, because that's what it has been for us to this point. And because of that, they're very loyal workers. Once they get a job, they cling on to it like their life depends upon it. But they're antisocial. They want to work remotely, preferably in a closet, preferably coding. These are not line jobs. These are not public service jobs. This is a very specific subset. So, if you're in San Jose and you need a bunch of coders, great. Your workforce is covered for the next 20 years. You need them for anything else? Yikes. So we are going to need automation, not just because we have fewer workers, but because the workforce of those fewer workers is very, very different from what we have had for the last 40 years. So we have to have it. On the flip side, automation is one of the most expensive things you can do. It's expensive to develop, to operationalize, to install, and people always forget about this step, the most expensive of all, to keep it updated. That takes capital. We're not going to have as much of that.